the mightiest ship ever built. 11 stories high with over 2,000 people on board. She was the most luxurious, most advanced vessel ever built by the hands of man. She was unsinkable. She was the Titanic. And yet, on this cold and moonless night of April 14, 1912, the Titanic raised its stern and slid reluctantly into the Atlantic. As she sank, she took more than 1,500 men, women, and children to a cold and lonely death on the floor of the ocean. It was never supposed to happen. The Titanic was the marvel of the 20th century, a monument to the technology and luxury of a new age, testimony of an era of unimaginable achievements. The press had called her unsinkable, and yet, barely 4 days on her maiden voyage, she was no more. How could it happen? In fact, why did Captain E.J. Smith, the most senior officer of the White Star Line, ignore no less than 6 warnings of icebergs ahead? Why did he continue to plunge ahead at a breakneck speed of over 22 knots in a pitch-dark night? Why did the ship carry only 16 lifeboats, enough for less than half the passengers on board? How could a modern ship with a double hull and watertight compartments sink in just 2 hours to the bottom of the ocean? Why were half-empty lifeboats cast off, while hundreds of passengers still struggled to get off the ship? And most important of all, why were most of the children in third class left to die, while many first-class celebrities were saved, including the managing director of the White Star Line, J. Bruce Ismay? Today, for the first time, we know most of the answers. The recent discovery of the wreck on the ocean floor nearly 2 miles below the surface has produced startling evidence. Tests of samples brought to the surface have led to an all-new theory as to what really happened to the Titanic. With this evidence in hand, we can now tell the story, the true story, of the greatest ocean disaster of modern times. At the beginning of the 20th century, it seemed as if the world had begun to move at a faster pace. The invention of electricity had changed everyday life forever. The invention of the automobile changed the cities once dominated by horses to one filled with private cars. Men had also begun to fly, from a few yards on a beach in North Carolina to the full length of the English Channel. Meanwhile, international trade was booming, sustained by an ever-expanding industrial capability. Manufacturing was increasingly automated, an idea that was perhaps best illustrated in the assembly lines of the Ford Motor Company. Here, Henry Ford turned out a new car every 93 minutes. Peace had reigned for nearly 100 years. It was a great time to be alive. On the other side of the Atlantic in England, times had changed too. Since the earliest of times, Britain had ruled the waves. As an island, she had little use for a large standing army. The sea was both England's defense and her lifeline to her growing colonial empire abroad. The center of Britain's naval might was Greenwich. Here were ships like the Cutty's Sark, who maintained Britain's lifeline by plowing the great oceans and defending merchant ships against pirates or other marauders. But ocean-going travel on large sailing ships was still a hazardous undertaking, and vessels routinely perished in the unpredictable weather conditions of the Atlantic. But the arrival of large metal-clad ships and steam-driven propulsion had changed all that. By 1890, ships had become so big that virtually everyone could afford to cross the Atlantic in relative comfort and safety. And nearly everyone did. Between 1900 and the start of World War I in 1914, more than 13 million people emigrated to the United States, mostly from Eastern and Southern Europe. More than 75% of these immigrants would pass through the harbor of New York. But for the shipping lines, there was little profit in carrying steerage passengers. It focused on a different clientele. The booming American industry had created a new social class all by itself, a class of the super rich. They were concentrated in New York, which by 1910 had become one of the leading capitals of the world. For these American tycoons, it became fashionable to travel to Europe at least once a year, if not for business, then certainly for a leisurely stay on the French Riviera or in Italy. By 1900, the first-class passenger had become the most coveted market of the international shipping trade. But he was a difficult customer to satisfy. The rich expected speed, comfort, and luxury. The German lines, always ready to beat the British on the high seas, moved quickly. The Hamburg American Line developed two luxurious new ships that cut deeply into the British market share. Cunard responded by launching a new class of its own, the Lusitania and the Mauretania. This new generation of ocean vessels offered spacious accommodations and traveled much faster than ever before. While both firms slugged it out for supremacy, the third service, the venerable White Star Line, had fallen behind. That was most displeasing to the richest man in the world, J.P. Morgan. In 1902, J.P. Morgan had bought the White Star Line to create a large conglomerate with a single objective, to beat the German and British competition. He was joined in this objective by the new managing director of the White Star Line, a man with few scruples. This man was J. Bruce Ismay. The story of the Titanic would start in earnest in Belgravia, one of London's most fashionable districts, long favored by the diplomatic corps. One night in 1907, Bruce Ismay was invited to dinner at Downshire House, the stately home of Lord Pirrie in London. Lord Pirrie was head of the largest shipyards in Great Britain, those of Harland and Wolff in Belfast. Over brandy and cigars, the two men hatched a daring plan. They were going to build 3 ships of unprecedented size, speed, and luxury. The largest of the 3 was a vessel called the Titanic, a ship so big, so modern, and so fast that she was going to blow the Lusitania, the fastest Cunard ship afloat, right out of the water. J.P. Morgan read the plan and was more than ready to agree. Ismay and Morgan had wanted a ship that was large, comfortable, and fast. Actually, the technology of the late 19th century made that a contradiction. Ships could be light, nimble, and fast, but the constant vibration of the engines and the roll of the ship could be most uncomfortable to passengers. Big ships with wide staterooms and multiple decks reduced the roll by the sheer virtue of their size and made for a stable voyage. But big ships were, of course, invariably slow. Harland and Wolff, the Belfast-based shipbuilders, thought they had the answer. To be comfortable, the Titanic had to be big, bigger than anything afloat. And so they designed a ship weighing over 46,000 tons, with a displacement of 66,000 tons. She would measure over 880 feet and 92 feet wide, 11 stories high, 4 city blocks long. In order to be able to propel this monster at high speed, the engineers designed 2 sets of 4-cylinder engines and combined it with the new low-pressure Parsons turbine. The net result of this ingenious construction was a propulsion system of 50,000 horsepower, capable of reaching a maximum speed of nearly 25 knots. To protect so vast a ship, it was given a double steel bottom reinforced with concrete. The hull was deliberately divided in a series of watertight compartments, each separated by strong bulkheads that could be sealed off at the touch of a button. The theory was that if 1, 2 or even 3 of these compartments flooded as a result of a collision, and the ship would still remain afloat. The bulkheads ran from the bottom to the 5th deck, the 4th deck in center. There the engineers stopped, thinking that they were high enough above the waterline. It proved to be a fatal mistake. When the ship was first shown to the press, the world waxed ecstatic. It was a wonder ship, one wrote. The most luxurious ever, a golden coach for millionaires. The magazine The Shipbuilder wrote,
"So perfect are her proportions that it is well nigh impossible for the inexperienced to grasp her magnitude except when seen alongside another vessel."
The shipbuilder added another note. It was, it wrote, practically unsinkable. It was a bold statement, and it caught everyone's attention. A ship that could not, under the worst of circumstances, sink. In the general enthusiasm, few would point out that this vast floating city carried only 16 lifeboats, an appallingly inadequate number for a ship with a capacity of over 3,000 passengers. In fact, the Titanic carried more lifeboats than regulations required, since the White Star Line had added 4 inflatable rafts. The Board of Trade was impressed and duly certified the ship seaworthy. After all, the lifeboats would never be used. She was, as they said, unsinkable. On April 10, 1912, the port city of Southampton was packed with excited voyagers, scheduled to depart on Titanic's maiden voyage. But the day had dawned under a bad omen. A coal strike was on, and it had led to an immediate shortage of coal. That was a particular problem for the huge furnaces of the Titanic, which consumed some 650 tons of coal per day. The White Star Line decided to cancel all other departures, including the scheduled trips of the Adriatic and the Oceanic. The company transferred the coal from these vessels to the Titanic. It also made the fateful decision to transfer the passengers and their luggage. These people were now rebooked in 2nd and 3rd class, since the accommodations on the other ships had been far less expensive. The company also decided to transfer additional crew from the other ships to the Titanic to deal with the swelling ranks of its passengers. The preordained hierarchy of the Titanic was upset. The ship's crew was now filled with officers, stewards, and firemen who were basically unfamiliar with the ship and its operations. On April 10, 1912 in Southampton, Captain E.J. Smith, Commodore of the White Star Line, and one of the most respected men of his profession, inspected his ship for the last time. Shortly thereafter, embarkation began. There arrived by taxi a long stream of passengers, the beautiful people that held the world of 1912 in thrall. John Jacob Astor and his young bride Madeline returning from an extended honeymoon in Egypt. Benjamin Guggenheim, the steel magnate, boarded the ship as well. Together, the first-class passengers represented a wealth estimated at well over $900 million. Shortly before 12 noon, bells rang, and the huge funnel whistles of the Titanic boomed across the harbor. Then slowly the Titanic escaped from her berth. The huge engines came to life, the ship shuddered, and its 3 giant screws began to turn. All along the shore, crowds were cheering. As she moved, the huge displacement of her hull started to pull at ships moored nearby. One ship, the New York, pulled loose and drifted towards the Titanic. Captain Smith was on the bridge and saw it happen. He quickly boosted the port engine, and the sudden wash pushed the New York back and out of harm's way. After short stops in Cherbourg and Queenstown, the ship turned west and headed for the Atlantic to meet her destiny. It now carried a total of 2,235 souls. For those booked in first class, a world of unprecedented luxury opened up. The smoking room exuded the comfortable coziness of a British club and was favored by the men after dinner. The Palm Court with its wicker furniture was a hit with the ladies, particularly at tea time. The Café Parisienne, on the other hand, was the meeting spot for the young crowd. It had the air of a breezy cafe on a sidewalk in Paris. The first-class staterooms were a world apart. Here, for the high and mighty, the ship's designers had gone to great lengths to either suggest the romance of an English Tudor home, the pleasant intimacy of a Victorian parlor, or the stately elegance of a bedroom in the style of Louis XVI. But the most splendid feature of the ship was its elegant first-class staircase. Keenly designed for ladies to make a dramatic entrance at night, topped with a large glass dome, it would have graced even the most discriminating of European hotels. On Sunday, April 14th, the fifth day of the voyage, the Titanic was steaming east at an accelerating pace. Ismay wanted the ship to beat the schedule. "We'll get to New York on Tuesday," he had said at dinner the night before. Captain Smith had merely nodded. At 9 a.m., Smith received a wireless message from a ship called the Coronia. Icebergs had been reported. Captain Smith read it and stuffed the message in his pocket. The ship plowed on at a breakneck speed of 23 to 24 knots. In the hours to come, more warnings arrived by wireless. The Baltic reporting ice at 1:42 p.m., very near the Titanic's course. The America reported ice 3 minutes later, followed by the Californian at 7:30 p.m. and the Mesaba at 9:40. The Californian decided that the ice field was too hazardous to continue, and the captain ordered all engines stopped. Captain Smith still decided to proceed. Why? Had Smith been specifically ordered by Ismay to set a speed record? Would so experienced a seaman, now on his last cruise before retirement, be ready to sacrifice safety for the greater glory of the White Star Line? We now know the startling truth. The Titanic was on fire. In fact, she had been on fire for several days. The huge piles of coal built to feed the hungry boilers had ignited from within. No one had been able to stop the white-hot furnace burning deep inside the pyramid of coal. None of the passengers were told. Under the circumstances, the Titanic had no choice but to race the clock. At 11:40 p.m., 40 minutes after the last warning, the Titanic bore down head-on towards an iceberg. As the watch in the crow's nest called out the alert, Captain Smith was not on deck. Had he been there, the captain would have known what to do. Try to ram it with the strongest part of the ship, the bow. But the helm was held by First Officer William Murdoch. He made two fatal mistakes. He turned hard to port, and rather than using speed to add momentum to the turn, he ordered a full speed astern, in reverse. He thus exposed the most vulnerable part of his ship, the flank, to the rock-solid, jagged edge. And he lost the speed necessary to avoid the collision. The watertight doors and the bulkheads were closed. Captain Smith and Thomas Andrews, the principal builder of the shipyards, raced down to see the damage for themselves. When they saw the water pour in, they stood in shock. The ship could float with 1, 2, maybe 3 compartments flooded. But with 5 compartments filled with water, the bow would slowly tip down. When that happened, the water would rise above the 5th deck, where there were no bulkheads to stop the water. Andrews knew that the ship was doomed. He made a quick calculation and turned to Captain Smith. The ship, he said, had about 90 minutes to live. Captain Smith ordered the passengers to prepare to abandon ship and turned his thoughts to the lifeboats. If filled to capacity, the lifeboats would be able to save 1,178 people. At least 1,000 people were going to die. He went to the radio room and ordered the immediate sending of the international distress signal, CQD MGY. CQD meant Attention Distress Signal. MGY was the call sign of the Titanic. The first-class passengers were roused first, followed by second class. Meanwhile, the crew struggled with the lifeboats. Only women and children were permitted to board. As the minutes ticked on, people became restless and started to push. In the confusion, the first lifeboats began to be lowered, but few were filled. Why? The reason is shockingly simple. The crew had never been trained in the use of the lifeboats. Worse, there had never been a drill for the passengers. The myth of the unsinkable ship had eliminated even the most elementary of safety precautions. At 1:30 a.m., as the last lifeboats were being filled, women and children from steerage were finally allowed on the boat deck, long after male passengers from first and second class had been permitted to climb into the boats. Few would make it. There remained one major misfortune to complete the tragedy. There was a ship in plain view just on the horizon. At a distance of only 10 miles, the officers of the Californian could clearly see the Titanic. None of the officers thought of turning on the wireless, in which case they would have heard the frantic distress calls of the dying ship. At 2:20 a.m., on the morning of April 15, 1912, it was finally over. The Titanic raised her stern. A massive roar filled the night as boilers, pianos, glass, and furniture broke loose and collided. Then slowly, the ship slid into the cold water of the Atlantic. As the morning dawned on the scene, the extent of the disaster became clear. There were only 12 lifeboats adrift. Many lifeboats were half empty. In all, 1,503 passengers and crew had perished. Of the passengers, those in third class were the most unfortunate. Less than 25% would survive. Only 69 men and 105 women were saved. They simply hadn't been given enough time to work their way up on deck and have a fair chance at a seat in a lifeboat. In second class, things were better for the women and children. 104 was saved versus 24 lost. But only 11 men made it to the lifeboats. First class passengers clearly had the edge. 145 women and children were saved. Only 11 were lost. A third of all men were rescued as well. In sum, the rate of survival in each of the classes were as follows. In first class, 31% of the men were saved, 93% of the women and children. In second class, only 11% of the men made it, but 81% of women and children were rescued. Finally, in third class, 536 men, women, and children died. Statistically, chances were better for the crew than for third class. Of the total complement of 899 hands, 194 men and 20 women would find a spot in the lifeboats. Most of the men had been ordered in the lifeboats by the officers in order to take charge of steering and rowing. At 4 a.m., the Carpathia arrived on the scene. A Cunard liner, she had picked up the distress signal and raced all night to get to the Titanic before she went under. 4 hours later, the last of the lifeboats was picked up, and the Carpathia headed for New York. Of the original complement of 2,207 passengers and crew, the Carpathia had been able to save only 705 hands. Back in New York, people were still blissfully unaware of the drama that was unfolding. Sunday, April 14 had been a clear and balmy day, and Central Park had been filled with people out for a walk with their children and friends. Down at the harbor, the berths of the White Star Line were abuzz with preparations for the first arrival of the Titanic. In Midtown Manhattan, meanwhile, the powerful wireless on top of the 18-story building of the New York Times was scanning the airwaves for news. Later that night, the wireless operator picked up a message from the relay station at Cape Race in Newfoundland.
At 10:25 tonight, the White Star Line steamship Titanic called CQD to the Marconi station here and reported having struck an iceberg. The steamer said that immediate assistance was required.
The New York Times decided on a risky gamble. With the few bits of information at hand, they tried to deduce what had happened, correctly as it turned out. By mid-morning, a vast crowd of relatives and friends began to build near the offices of the White Star Line in New York. Similar scenes were taking place in front of Oceanic House in London, the headquarters of the White Star Line. Throngs of people waited for hours for any word of survivors. Then, at 4:35 p.m., a new message was received in New York. It came through the powerful transmitter on top of the Wanamaker's department store. The operator was the young David Sarnoff, the future founder of RCA.
Titanic has foundered at 12:47 a.m. New York time. Her only survivors, estimated at 675 souls, are aboard the Carpathia, now bound for New York.
The news finally started to sink in. A terrible tragedy had happened, a disaster at sea that had put the high hopes of the modern era to shame. Over 1,500 innocent people had died a horrible death. Ocean-going travel was never going to be the same. Both the British Board of Trade and an American Senate subcommittee launched investigations into what happened. Their wrath was soon turned on J. Bruce Ismay, who had climbed into a lifeboat while countless women and children were still on deck. But the greatest scorn was reserved for Captain Stanley Lord of the Californian, who had been in a position to save the majority of Titanic's passengers. Apart from a villain, the press was also searching for a hero in this tragic story. The choice soon fell on Second Officer Lightoller. He had helped many women and children safely into the lifeboats, and by mere chance, he himself had been saved. But a close inspection of the transcripts of the Senate hearing and subsequent investigations tell a different story. It was Lightoller who had ordered the lifeboats to be lowered, even if they were less than half full. Why? Lightoller stated he was afraid that the boats, if filled to capacity in their davits, would break in two. But had Lightoller been more familiar with the ship, he would have known that Harland and Wolff had conducted exhaustive tests of the lifeboats filled with people. It had been his duty to know. And at the very least, the ship's officers should have conducted a drill with the passengers during the voyage. Question: had such a drill been scheduled? Answer: yes, on Sunday, the day of the collision. Question: had it been carried out? Answer: no. For this, hundreds of people would pay with their lives. Lightoller also claimed that near the end, there was no one on deck to fill the last of the lifeboats. Question: did steerage passengers have the right to go on the boat deck? Answer: every right. Question: there was no restraint? Answer: absolutely none. But the situation was quite different. The waterproof bulkhead served another, more sinister function: to block the access from third class to second and first, including the boat deck. In fact, most of the third-class passengers who escaped did so by jumping into lifeboats that had been lowered to A deck by officers other than Lightoller. A sample of the lifeboats tell the story. Boat 5, 35 seats filled, 30 vacant. Boat 8, 28 seats filled, 37 vacant. Boat 1, 12 seats filled, 53 vacant. Boat 2, 30 seats filled, 35 vacant. With these 4 boats alone, An additional 155 passengers could have been saved if it hadn't been for the inexperience of the crew. The investigations continued, but neither committee had the heart to accuse any individual or company of criminal conduct. The powerful influence of J.P. Morgan prevented any action against his interest in the White Star Line, and the British Board of Trade was anxious to avoid any negative impact on British shipping, and the suggestion that itself had been at fault by allowing an insufficient number of lifeboats on the ship. What remained for 73 long years was the public imagination. What had really happened to the ship after she sank? Was she still intact? Would there still be any bodies preserved in the icy temperatures of the ocean floor at a depth of nearly 2 miles? In 1985, after many international attempts to locate the wreck, a French team finally discovered the Titanic on the bottom of the ocean floor. From then on, a number of expeditions have visited the site, capturing the death scene with submersible cameras. From this shocking video, scientists were able to piece together what happened as the Titanic slid underwater. Under the sheer pressure of its enormous weight, the ship literally broke in two, separating just between the third and fourth funnels. There was an obvious place for the break to occur. Here were the large and open first-class areas, the weakest point in the structure. As the ship continued to sink deeper, the three remaining funnels broke off. The bow section, which had long since been filled with water, probably hit the ocean floor first. Its prow was buried deep into the sand and silt. As the vast bow section settled down, its metal skin buckled and ruptured, but the structure still remained recognizable. The stern section of the ship suffered a far more violent fate. It had remained upright for a long time, and as it plunged into the ocean, it still contained large pockets of air. As the pressure built, the air exploded out of the ship, taking large parts of the structure with it. When it finally crashed on the ocean floor, the stern collapsed. But the most important discovery was made after close inspection of the starboard hull. It provided the final proof of what happened on the night of April 14, 1912. For 75 years, people had believed that the iceberg had torn a long 300-foot gash across the ship's metal plating. But the photographic evidence showed what really happened. As the large, submerged section of the iceberg pressed against the ship, the rivets began to pop. The plates buckled, and the ship's skin slowly gave way. Once the pressure built momentum, more and more rivets failed, and an increasing number of plates began to buckle. It was a cascade effect. This explains why the damage was so devastating, why in so short a time, a third of the ship's structure collapsed and doomed the vessel forever. As a result, there is today sufficient evidence to point to the cause of the great Titanic disaster. Cause number one, a flawed design. With incomplete bulkheads, no searchlight on the bow, and far too few lifeboats for the passengers she carried. Cause number two, poor discipline. Officers and crew unfamiliar with lifeboat capacity and drill procedures, and careless about the safety of steerage passengers. Cause number three, extraordinary conditions. With a flat sea, therefore no breakers to signal icebergs. No moon and very cold temperatures for the time of the year. Cause number four, carelessness. The ship was moving at far too great a speed through a minefield of ice floes, and none of the lookouts had binoculars, which could have given the Titanic a few extra precious seconds in response time. The mindset of an unsinkable ship had cursed the Titanic, her captain and her crew, and been a major cause of the horrific loss of life that was to follow. "85 years have passed, but the haunting memory of the Titanic remains. Today, on both sides of the Atlantic, silent markers still remind the world of the most spectacular sea disaster of our time. Few communities felt the blow as heavily as Southampton. Most of the Titanic crew lived here with their families. There were few homes that remained untouched by the horror of the Titanic. In Southampton's East Park, the city erected a monument for all the engineers on board the Titanic. They, like so many innocent men, women, and children who sailed on the ship, had stayed on board the vessel while others boarded the lifeboats. And to a last man, the engineers went down with her to a cold and lonely grave.